Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Election Day is less than a week away. Candidates across the country are entering the final few days of campaigning. This year may turn out to be one of the more interesting midterm elections in recent decades. New campaign finance data shows House and Senate candidates are on pace to spend close to $2 billion by next Tuesday, a record high. Meanwhile, most polls are forecasting the Democrats will lose control of the House. And while Republicans are expected to pick up a number of seats in the Senate, Democrats are expected to hold on to the majority, which would result in a rare split Congress. For more on the latest numbers and for analysis of the midterm elections, we're joined by two guests. Nate Silver is a leading pollster and the founder of the polling analyst site 538.com, which is on the New York Times website. And Ari Berman is a political correspondent for The Nation magazine. He's author of the new book, Herding Donkeys, The Fight to Rebuild the Democratic Party and Reshape American Politics. Welcome both to Democracy Now!
Thanks
Nate, let's begin with you. Why don't you give us an overview of where we stand now, less than a week out?
Well, you know, it looks pretty bad for the Democrats overall. In the House, you know, our view is that they're most likely to lose about 50 seats, which would mean losing control of the chamber. We think there's a big margin of error on that forecast where, you know, pollsters have trouble getting people on the phone sometimes, or different techniques. It's going to play out different ways.
What are the techniques that pollsters use?
Well, you know, the old thing is everyone used to have their kind of rotary telephone, and you kind of called them, and the first person picked up, and it was all very kind of, you know, traditional, right? But now people screen phone calls, right? People have cell phones, which some pollsters call, but some do not. You know, some people don't. How
do they have records of cell phone numbers?
You can buy a list of cell phone numbers, and that's actually fairly easy to do, but it's a little bit more expensive. You kind of have to compensate people for their airtime. Sometimes you might have higher refusal rates, people hanging up on you, and so, you know, pollsters who are trying to get polling out as quickly as possible, and just kind of get their poll out in the media and get kind of free media time out of that, sometimes won't bother to include cell phone voters in their polls, which in some places is, you know, is 25% or 30% or half the population even.
So talk about the picture for the Senate as well.
So the Senate is a little bit more favorable to Democrats just because, you know, there are only so many seats that are in play, and Republicans would have to win almost all of them to take control of the Senate. You know, right now we think that they're going to do very well in the Midwest and in much of the country, but fall a little bit short in California and Washington, where you have Democratic incumbents, and because of that, they would get up to 49 or maybe 50 Senate seats, but not get a 51st. But there's uncertainty there too. If you have this kind of enthusiasm gap, so-called, which is manifest in other parts of the country, also present in California, they could still win that race potentially, or Washington State. But it does look like Democrats are going to hold enough seats to maintain at least kind of nominal, kind of provisional control of the Senate, and then you can have, you know, big fights once the Congress reconvenes in January, where they're trying to recruit a Joe Lieberman or a Ben Nelson. You know, you could also have you could have the case where they keep control of the Senate officially on Election Day, but lose it, you know, sometime between then and when the Congress convenes, or just after it does in January.
The issue of polls in general, the corporate media focuses almost exclusively on polls, not talking as much about issues, which we are also going to talk about today, issues. But I want to look at, for example, in New York, when Mayor Bloomberg ran against Bill Thompson, it was predicted that Bill Thompson was going to lose big time.
Right.
Obama did not come in to help him. They said he would lose in the major double digits. I don't know what they said, maybe 20%. He lost by the narrowest of margins in a case where Mayor Bloomberg spent more money than any candidate in history. And if the polls had been talked about in a different way, I think what they mainly did is they immobilized people. People thought, well, there's not a prayer for Bill Thompson. So how will you avoid this?
Well, you know, what we're trying to do is put as much context around the polls as possible and kind of reward the pollsters that do go to more lengths to kind of properly survey public opinion and not kind of get too caught up in the spin and, you know, talk about them in an educated way. But, you know, it is a question. How do polls and the interpretation of polls affect behavior? You know, I mean, I think in that Bloomberg race, for example, last year, you can almost argue that in some ways it helped Thompson being a little bit behind in the polls, because Bloomberg is a guy who had a 70% approval rating at the time, but people didn't like what he did to run for a third term. They didn't like having to see all those commercials day after day. When, you know, here in New York, the New Jersey commercials too, and the Connecticut commercials, you get way too much campaign advertising, right? So I thought, oh, you know, he's not going to lose, so I'll kind of cast my protest vote, right? I'm annoyed by him. I don't dislike him, but I'm annoyed by him. And, you know, Thompson seems like a nice guy. And lo and behold, if a few more people had done that, he would have lost. You know, I think
but 2-3 percentage points that would have made the difference. But I think many people just didn't come out because they didn't. You had very
low turnout. One thing that's clear is that when the polls are tighter, that does motivate turnout. I mean, in some countries, you know, in France, for example, you can't issue a poll within, I think it is 48 or 72 hours of the election. They don't want to do anything to deter people from coming out. They want to create some mystery, I suppose. And I don't know. You know, I think. I think certainly in terms of polls, we have too much of an emphasis now on quantity instead of quality. You know, and it kind of gives maybe too much influence to people who aren't really serious about trying to get the pulse of public opinion, but just trying to put numbers out there as fast as possible to get more traffic to their websites and so forth.
Governor's races.
So this is an area where Democrats are also doing fairly poorly, but they'll probably win a couple of large states. It looks like in California, Jerry Brown has actually, you know, a fairly meaningful lead now over Meg Whitman, maybe about 7 or 8 points. You know, Andrew Cuomo here in New York is certainly very likely to win. The race in Florida seems to be a toss-up, but maybe slightly leaning for the Democrats. But in the Midwest, it's Republicans in almost every state, save for perhaps Minnesota. You know, where the economy is poor, where you often have Democratic incumbents. I mean, Ted Strickland looks like he'll lose in Ohio. Chet Culver in Iowa, the GOP's favorite in Michigan as well. So that's where you're going to see, you know, a big kind of splotch of red on the map, and that'll be impactful because we're redistricting in the Congress before the next before 2012.
Now, this is very significant, right? The census and what redistricting means.
Right. So, you know, basically what happens in a state like Michigan, for example, which is losing population relative to the rest of the country, right? It will lose 1 or 2 seats in Congress. Now, the governor and the state legislature has a lot of power over kind of basically which incumbent loses the game of musical chairs and kind of has his seat yanked and has to go fight for some other seat where there's another incumbent. And if you have Snyder, the Republican, winning the governorship of Michigan by 15 or 20 points, and that probably also means they'll win a lot of seats in the state legislature, that means they'll probably get essentially a bonus seat in Congress in 2012. So this is another thing that might kind of have reverberations for a couple more election cycles from this one.
Ari Berman, now not from the polling point of view, but from the party point of view, the landscape we're seeing today in these midterm elections.
Well, the landscape is not good for the Democrats, as Nate pointed out. I mean, you have this sky-high Republican enthusiasm, a very energized Republican base that I think Democrats did not believe that the turnaround of the Republican Party would occur so quickly. It looked after the 2008 election like the Republican Party was headed towards an extended civil war with negative electoral ramifications, but it's turned out that they're in a bit of a civil war, but it hasn't hurt the party. If anything, it's helped it, because now there's all this grassroots enthusiasm on the right, backed by, as you've talked a lot about on this program, a huge infusion of corporate money. So those two things combined, and a sour mood on the public. I mean, we're basically in the 3rd straight anti-incumbent election. 2006, 2008, now 2010 are a lot of the same dynamics when people are really unhappy with the government in Washington. And Barack Obama's election, I think, and this is what I talk about a lot in the book, was really supposed to change that mood, that Barack Obama was supposed to be a unique outside-the-beltway reformer who would come in and really shake up what was viewed as a dysfunctional, corrupt Washington system. That hasn't happened. Obama, I think, looks like he's playing by the rules instead of changing them. People are still unhappy with democratic governance, and I think, you know, a bad economy is weighing the president and his party down, and not only weighing the president and his party down, but I think disproportionately affecting key segments of the president's base. African Americans, Latinos, young people, single women. I mean, these were really the core of Obama's constituency. And if they're not, if they're struggling, and if they're losing their home, if they're losing their job, if they can't pay the bills, then that's going to make it a lot more difficult for them to go out and vote and volunteer and feel that hope that they felt in 2008.
Speaking of not being able to pay the bills, I wanted to talk about the issue of rent. Because that became a big issue in the New York governor's race. One of the most unusual debates we have seen is the New York governor's race. You know, everyone, I mean, in the country, people may have heard of the Republican Carl Palladino versus Andrew Cuomo, the Democrat. But they decided to allow in the many different parties. And they had the Green Party, the Libertarian Party in the debates. I mean, in other cases, Laura Wells, the Green Party candidate for governor, was arrested in California when she tried to attend a debate. Yeah. And we see very little coverage of progressive third parties. So we see a tremendous amount of coverage from the beginning of the Tea Party. But when you have a debate like this, the response to people outside the Democratic and Republican Party that are not necessarily Tea Party has been phenomenal. One of the most popular YouTube clips of this election cycle is of a little-known third-party candidate here in New York running for governor, Jimmy McMillan, of the Rent is Too Damn High party. He appeared last week in this 7-way debate for New York governor. The debate was hosted by New York One.
I represent the Rent is Too Damn High party. People are working 8 hours a day and 40 hours a week to some a third job. Women can't afford to take care of their children, feed their children breakfast, lunch, and dinner. My main job is to provide a roof over your head, food on the table, and money in your pocket. This is politics as usual, playing a silly game. It's not going to happen. The Rent Too Damn High movement, the people I'm here to represent can't afford to pay their rent. They're being laid off right now as I speak. They can't eat breakfast, lunch, or dinner. Listen, someone's stomach, child's stomach just growled. Did you hear it? Got to listen like me.
Okay.
Let's talk about the issue. People can't afford to pay their
Cuomo,
rent.
30 seconds for you, sir.
Rent is too damn high.
Which was repeated over and over, and soon being repeated by the major candidates like Andrew Cuomo. The rent is too damn high. I mean, this really rang a bell. But speaking of that, I wanted to ask you, Nate Silver, even polling gives people information about who's running.
Right. And pollsters sometimes are kind of arbitrary about whether to include a third-party candidate or third-party candidates or not. You know, for a while, Rick Lazio here was running on the Conservative Party line in New York, and some pollsters didn't include him. That helped Palladino's numbers in the polls, and then lo and behold, you know, Lazio dropped out because it looked like Palladino was viable. He's turned out probably not to be. But you have dynamics like that that are a little bit frightening sometimes, the amount of kind of power really that kind of pollsters have, and I guess kind of me as an interpreter and aggregator of polling indirectly to kind of influence the narrative. And so you have to, I think, you know, try and apply rigorous kind of standards and be kind of a good journalist, and you know, and think about the impact you're having on the public at the same time. You know,
would you have advice for pollsters? I mean, for example, on the Weather Channel, when one of the leading newscasters said people have to start talking about global warming, the weathermen and women on TV, not just talk about, you know, the extreme weather in Indiana or Ohio. What about that for pollsters?
Well, you know, I think you talk about third parties, for example. I think pollsters should try and replicate the ballot, right, at least for their first question, right? I mean, sometimes they fear like, oh, if you give people too many choices, then they'll drift off, even though they really have a Democratic preference or a Republican one, right? They'll say Green Party or Libertarian Party and so on and so forth. But, you know, I think your job is not to shape public opinion, but to reflect it. If you're a pollster,
and don't pollsters often shape it by the questions they
I'm sure they do, you know, and sometimes there are poor incentives as well. Or, for example, you know, it's a bigger story if, for example, you show Carl Palladino having closed the race to 8 points instead of 20 or something, you know, and maybe, I don't even think it's conscious for the most part, I think, but maybe, you know, pollsters have to make decisions about kind of what kind of turnout model they use, about what assumptions they make about demographics, and I think maybe, you know, you might put your finger on the scale toward making the race tighter or more dramatic. Some polls are notorious for bouncing up and down because it creates better kind of headlines, right, that it kind of settles in on the right number. So one thing we do now is not just look at the final poll, but also the ones kind of leading up to it, right? Where if a pollster has the numbers bouncing all over, it often means that, you know, they don't have a very good model and are just trying to kind of create drama.
We're going to come back to this discussion. We're talking to Nate Silver and Ari Berman. Ari Berman, author of Herding Donkeys, The Fight to Rebuild the Democratic Party and Reshape American Politics. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. Back in a minute.